Family has always been my foundation but also my greatest source of challenges. My name is Emily, the daughter who grew up hearing that effort always brings reward. And I believed it with all my heart. My parents, Susan and James, are two generous, dedicated, and loving individuals. As for my younger brother Michael, well, he's a story of his own. Despite being charismatic and full of good intentions, his unemployment has become a significant burden in recent years. Not for him, of course, but for all of us. And as always, I ended up being the bridge that keeps everything running smoothly. Family dynamics haven't always been easy. I'm the one who rolls up her sleeves, who solves problems. Michael, he's more the type to wait for things to fix themselves. Despite this, I never saw myself as someone who blames others. But it's hard not to feel a little resentment when I see my parents treating him as if he were still a teenager with no responsibilities. On the other hand, I know they just want to protect the one they see as more vulnerable. Even so, there are times when I feel the weight of being the strong one falling entirely on my shoulders. When I decided to give my parents a luxury home, I thought it would mark a turning point for all of us. It was my way of giving back for everything they had done for me and, at the same time, strengthening the bond between us. I envisioned this change bringing peace, an opportunity to start fresh, to connect with each other more easily. Little did I know this decision would become the trigger for a series of problems I could never have predicted. Since I was little, I've always seen myself as the daughter who wanted to make a difference. When I started planning the luxury house for my parents, I knew it would be something extraordinary, something that would show how much I valued them. It wasn't just about buying a house. It was about building a dream with every detail carefully thought out. I chose the finest materials. Marble floors, windows that perfectly captured the sunset, and a kitchen that my mother, Susan, had always dreamed of having. It was my way of saying thank you for everything they had sacrificed for me. It was a heartfelt project and I was determined to make it perfect. The motivations behind it were deeper than anyone could imagine. Of course, I wanted to please my parents, but there was also an almost unconscious desire to prove something to myself. I had always wanted to be the daughter they could look at with pride. And, in a way, this house was the embodiment of that feeling. It wasn't just about generosity. It was a mix of love, gratitude, and perhaps a hint of guilt for always being so busy with my career and away from them. Every time I thought about the smiles on Susan and James' faces, I felt that all the effort was worth it. And effort was something I didn't lack. Financing that house required enormous sacrifices. I worked extra hours, gave up trips I wanted to take, and postponed other personal dreams to ensure everything was paid for without debt. The project consumed not only my savings but also my emotional energy. It was exhausting, but I never let it show. The thought of seeing my parents living in that house gave me the strength to keep going. Little did I know that, in the end, this gift would become the source of a problem I could never have anticipated. When I finally told my parents, Susan and James, about the house, I waited anxiously for their reaction. To me it was a dream come true, but for them it seemed like a mix of surprise and disbelief. My mother stayed silent for a few seconds before covering her mouth with her hands, while my father let out a nervous laugh, saying something like, "Emily, you didn't have to do this." Despite their modest words, the emotion in their eyes was unmistakable. For a moment I felt like all the effort had been worth it. They were excited, or at least I thought they were. Till something felt off. While Susan enthusiastically inspected every detail of the house, from the impeccably painted walls to the enormous windows flooding the space with incredible light, James remained more reserved. "This is too much for us, don't you think?" he asked, almost as if he wanted to downplay the grandeur of the gift. His reluctance wasn't exactly rejection, but rather a subtle reminder that something about it made them uneasy. Perhaps it was the idea of accepting something so big without having given anything in return. Or maybe it was something else, something harder to pinpoint. It was in this context that the first sign of imbalance in our family dynamic began to emerge. During lunch, Michael joined the conversation in his usual tone, half joking, half serious. "Well, it looks like you've got plenty of space. Maybe I should move in too." Everyone laughed, but something in my parents' expressions unsettled me. It was as if the idea wasn't so absurd to them. In that moment I started to realize that, even though I was the one who had planned and financed everything, the family balance was about to shift. and not in my favor. What happened next still leaves me speechless. The idea of Michael moving into the luxury house started as a casual joke, but within weeks, it turned into a serious discussion. My parents, Susan and James, decided, without even consulting me, that he would move into the house I had given them. They in turn would stay in the old house, the modest home where I grew up. When they told me, it felt like a punch to the gut. "Michael is going through a tough time," my mother said, her voice filled with compassion. "He needs a place to start over." I was stunned. I tried to understand the logic behind their decision, but everything felt so unfair. "But what about you? The house was meant for you, not for him," I argued, trying to keep my composure. My father sighed and said something like, "We're fine where we are. The house is too big for just the two of us, but it might be the perfect place for him to get back on his feet." That was their reasoning. There was no anger, just an infuriating calmness that only reinforced how much they believed they were doing the right thing. The decision seemed final, and I didn't know what else to say without coming across as selfish or ungrateful. Michael, on the other hand, accepted the news with complete ease. He seemed comfortable, almost enthusiastic, as if this were the logical next step. "I promise I'll take good care of it," he said with a carefree smile that made my blood boil. There wasn't a hint of hesitation or guilt. It was as if he were receiving something that was already rightfully his. Meanwhile, I felt increasingly alienated, as if the gift I had given had somehow turned into a debt I never knew I owed. That's when I realized, the house, which was supposed to bring our family closer together, was tearing us apart. I found out almost by accident, which made it even worse. During a casual phone conversation with my mother, she casually mentioned that Michael was already arranging to move into the luxury house. "And what about you?" I asked, trying to ignore the icy feeling creeping up my spine. "Oh, darling, we think it's better for us to stay here in our house," she replied, her tone almost too light, as if she were telling me she had changed her mind about Sunday dinner. There was no announcement, no preparation. It was as if the decision had been made long ago and no one thought to inform me. My initial reaction was pure shock. I could barely respond. My heart was racing and my mind was spinning, trying to process what she had just said. Then came the sadness. That house wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything I had done for them, of the sacrifices I made to ensure my parents' comfort. And now it felt like it had been handed over to my brother without so much as a conversation with me. It didn't take long for the sadness to morph into a deep, simmering anger. I needed answers. Confronting my parents was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. "Why did you do this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady but failing. My mother avoided my gaze while my father, as always, stepped into the role of mediator. "Emily, we thought it was the best decision for everyone," he said, as if that were enough to close the matter. I pushed for more, demanding explanations, but all I got were vague responses about Michael needing it more than us. The frustration was almost unbearable. It felt as if all my dedication had been completely overlooked. But deep down, I knew this conversation wasn't over. I just needed more time to decide how I was going to handle it. As I tried to process what had happened with the house, I began to realize that this situation wasn't exactly new. In hindsight, I could see that patterns of favoritism had been present in our family dynamic for years. Michael had always been the more protected one. When we were kids, I remember working hard to win an award at school, but the praise I received never seemed to last as long as the attention given to anything he did, even if it was something minor. "He's more sensitive," my mother would say, as if that justified the extra care. Perhaps I learned early on that my role was to be the strong, independent one while he was allowed to be the protected one. Looking back, I can pinpoint several moments that hinted at this unequal treatment. Like the time I saved for months to buy my bike, while Michael got one as a gift simply because he asked for it. I always assumed it was because I was the eldest, that more was expected of me. But now, as an adult, I see it was more than just differing expectations. It was a pattern. A pattern that, without realizing it, shaped much of how I saw myself and perhaps how I related to others. Being the strong one came with an emotional toll that I've only recently begun to understand. This favoritism, subtle as it might have been, left scars. I spent much of my life trying to compensate for the imbalance, trying to prove my worth. Maybe that's why I worked so hard, poured so much into my career, as if to show that, despite everything, I was deserving of attention and pride. The decision to give my parents the house was, in many ways, the pinnacle of this quest for recognition. And now, seeing how things unfolded, it was impossible not to feel like all that effort had been in vain. It wasn't just about the house. It was about years of a dynamic that was finally coming to light in full force. Trying to understand my parents' perspective was like navigating an emotional maze. As hurt as I was, I knew that Susan and James weren't bad people. They had always put family first, but their decisions didn't always reflect fairness. When I directly questioned why they had decided that Michael should live in the house, their justifications were always vague. My mother mentioned wanting to help the child who needed it most. My father talked about doing what was best for everyone, but these explanations never seemed enough. It was as if they were clinging to an invisible logic, one that made sense only to them. There was, however, a pattern in the way they acted. Maybe it was a matter of tradition, the old idea that the youngest child needs more support, while the eldest is automatically seen as more capable. Or perhaps it was pressure, a silent guilt for never having been able to help Michael find stability. My mother always had a look of pity when she spoke about him, as if every mistake he made was somehow her fault. Maybe for them this was their last chance to make things right. But what about me? Where did that leave me in this equation? Hearing their justifications, I began to see something deeper. The expectations my parents had for me and for Michael had always been different. They expected me to be strong, independent, the one who didn't need help. From Michael they expected the opposite, that he was fragile, in need of support. This division of roles was never explicitly spoken, but it had always been there, shaping the way we were treated. The decision about the house wasn't just a practical choice. It was a reflection of years of unequal expectations. And deep down they might not have even realized the impact it had, not just on me but on our family as a whole. Michael was never one to hide his emotions, and his reaction to our parents' decision was exactly what I expected. He accepted the move to the luxury house with a nonchalance that left me baffled. There was no hesitation, not even a comment about how this might affect me. When I tried to bring it up, he simply shrugged and said, "Emily, you already have your life figured out. Why does this matter so much to you?" That sentence echoed in my mind for days. It wasn't just the lack of empathy. It was the certainty he had that he was entitled to occupy a space that wasn't his. At no point did Michael try to mend the situation. He didn't ask how I felt, nor did he offer any gesture of acknowledgement or direct gratitude. He seemed oblivious to the impact all of this was having on our family dynamic. Perhaps, to him, it was just another example of the favoritism that had always been present. He was comfortable in the role of the child who needs help, and in his mind that absolved him of any guilt. But for me it was more than that. It was as if he had chosen to ignore the emotional responsibility that came with such a decision. Before this incident, our relationship was functional at best. We weren't particularly close, but there had never been major conflicts either. I had always tried to support him in my own way, even if that often meant stepping back so as not to interfere with how he handled things. But after this, something shifted. It wasn't just resentment. It was a deep sense of emotional distance that seemed impossible to bridge. Every interaction with him felt like a constant reminder of how unequally our roles within the family had been defined. And no matter how much I wanted to salvage something from our relationship, I wasn't sure if it was possible to go back to the way things were before. In the days following my parents' decision, I found myself consumed by a relentless mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. It was hard to look at the situation without feeling like all the effort and sacrifice I had poured into that house had been in vain. At night, I would replay the conversations in my head, wondering what I could have said or done differently. But deep down I knew nothing would have changed. My parents had already made their choice, and now I had to deal with the aftermath. Still, that didn't make the pain any less intense. In the short term, family relations became strained, to say the least. I avoided calls and visits, knowing my presence would only add to the discomfort. My parents tried to act as though nothing had happened, sending casual messages or asking about my work, but the superficiality of their words only irritated me more. Michael, on the other hand, seemed indifferent. He was busy enjoying his new house, completely oblivious to the rift forming between us. Every interaction, even virtual, was laced with tension, as though everyone was walking on eggshells to avoid a heated argument. Friends and extended family began to notice something was wrong. Some even asked directly, "Emily, why have you been so distant from your family lately?" When I explained what had happened, the reactions were mixed. Some were shocked, while others tried to justify my parents' actions as well-intentioned. But a close friend, Sarah, said something that struck me deeply. You deserve recognition, not just for everything you've done but for who you are. Don't let them make you feel small. Those words gave me a glimmer of strength, but the emotional impact was still palpable, and the road to overcoming it all felt long and uncertain. As days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the thoughts of what had happened. I began to question not just my parents and Michael's behavior, but also what it revealed about our family dynamic. Perhaps it was easier for them to make this decision because, deep down, they believed I could handle it. Emily is strong, she always figures things out, they must have thought. And maybe that was the problem. They saw me as someone who didn't need care or consideration, while Michael, in their eyes, always seemed to need rescuing. Their perception of us had shaped our lives in ways I was only just beginning to understand. I spent a lot of time reflecting on my role in the family. I had always strived to be the responsible daughter, the one who solves problems and never causes trouble. But had I, in doing so, reinforced the idea that my voice didn't matter as much? Had my efforts to prove my worth inadvertently taught them to overlook my needs? As painful as it was to admit, I realized that I had often put others' needs ahead of my own. The house was the clearest example of this. I gave an enormous gift, but deep down I had expected something in return. Recognition. And when I didn't receive it, the frustration forced me to confront truths I had ignored for years. Amid this emotional chaos, I began to notice the first signs of change. It wasn't immediate, but a slow and internal transformation. I knew I needed to reevaluate my boundaries and, more importantly, learn to express what I truly felt. Maybe it was time to stop carrying so much weight and let others take on some responsibility. For the first time in a long while, I began to think less about what others expected of me and more about what I expected of myself. And that idea, uncomfortable as it was at first, brought with it a sense of hope I hadn't felt in years. After the incident, the family dynamic was never the same. Interactions that were once sprinkled with occasional laughter and casual conversations became cold and calculated. My parents, Susan and James, seemed to walk a tightrope whenever they spoke to me, trying to keep things light but carefully avoiding any mention of the house or Michael. On the other hand, my brother seemed oblivious to the tension. He acted as though nothing had happened, talking about the house as if it were entirely his, casually mentioning renovations he wanted to make, never considering how that might sound to me. The emotional distance between us grew more apparent with each conversation. Resentments began to grow like a shadow that couldn't be ignored. Every family gathering was marked by awkward silences and avoided glances. I tried to keep my composure, but deep down the hurt was hard to hide. It wasn't just about the house, it was about what it symbolized. My parents' decision had made it clear that Michael's needs outweighed my contributions in their eyes. And that hurt. Even though I tried to convince myself that I shouldn't care, every small gesture or casual comment felt like a reminder of how out of place I felt within my own family. There were some attempts at reconciliation, but they all felt superficial. My mother suggested a family dinner, trying to recreate the warm atmosphere we once had, but the discomfort was palpable. My father, in a rare moment of honesty, told me they never meant to hurt me. "We just wanted to help Michael," he said, but the weight of those words wasn't enough to heal the wounds. As for Michael, he never apologized or made any effort to understand my side, which only deepened the chasm between us. Despite everyone's efforts to maintain appearances, the family bond was fractured. And I couldn't help but wonder if it would ever be possible to piece it back together. That year's Christmas was unlike any other. For the first time, the family gathering took place at the luxury house, now occupied by my brother, Michael. The invitation arrived weeks in advance, but to be honest, I almost didn't go. It felt ironic to celebrate a holiday about togetherness in a place that symbolized everything that had driven us apart. Still, I decided to attend, more out of respect for my parents than for any other reason. When I arrived, Michael greeted me, visibly at ease, as if he had lived there forever. He enthusiastically showed off the Christmas decorations he had chosen, while I feigned interest, trying to mask the mix of discomfort and resentment brewing inside me. During dinner, the dynamic between my parents and Michael was, at the very least, intriguing. My mother seemed to be in peak maternal pride, praising every detail of the house, from the Christmas tree to the outdoor lighting. My father, as usual, maintained a more neutral demeanor, but I couldn't ignore the way he glanced at me from time to time, as if trying to gauge my reactions. Michael, on the other hand, seemed entirely carefree. He cracked jokes, poured wine, and played the role of the perfect host, completely oblivious to the tension hovering over the table. For him, it was as if everything was just as it should be. There was a moment during the gift exchange when I thought my parents might finally acknowledge the impact of their actions. I gave them a simple yet meaningful present, a frame with a photo of us from years ago, and for a fleeting second, I saw a shadow of guilt in my mother's eyes. She held my hand briefly as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Michael, on the other hand, seemed immune to any sense of remorse. To him, it was just another Christmas. I left the house that night with the feeling that, even if they never admitted it, perhaps deep down my parents knew something was wrong. But knowing and doing something about it are entirely different things. The incident with the house was a turning point in my life, a catalyst for changes I might never have faced otherwise. I realized that, for years, I had put myself second in an effort to maintain family harmony and prove my worth. My parents' decision and Michael's attitude were painful, but they also forced me to look inward. I came to understand that my value wasn't tied to what I could do for others but to who I was as a person. It was a difficult but transformative lesson. For the first time, I began to ask myself, what do I want for me? With this new perspective, my approach to family relationships changed. It wasn't about cutting ties or creating walls, but about setting healthy boundaries. I realized I didn't need to silently accept everything to be a good daughter or sister. Now, when my mother tries to justify their decision, I don't avoid the topic. I calmly explain how it made me feel. With Michael, my approach is different. I no longer expect acknowledgement or changes in his behavior. Instead, I focus on protecting my peace, interacting with him only when I genuinely want to, not out of obligation. This shift wasn't easy, but it was necessary for my emotional well-being. The greatest lesson from all of this was about self-worth. I realized that years of trying to please others hadn't brought me the validation I sought, but rather exhaustion and frustration. Today, I've learned to say no without guilt, to prioritize my own needs, and to value myself regardless of others' approval. This process of transformation is still ongoing, but I feel stronger and more self-aware than ever before. The luxury house may have caused a rupture in our family dynamic, but in a way it also gave me something invaluable: the opportunity to rediscover myself and reevaluate what truly matters in my life. There was a moment when I thought reconciliation might be possible. After Christmas, my parents suggested a family lunch, saying they wanted to talk. I accepted the invitation with a mix of hope and skepticism. During the meal, my mother began by saying, "Emily, we want you to know how grateful we are for everything you've done for us." It was a good start, but soon after, the conversation shifted back to the familiar tone of justifying why Michael needed the house more than I did. My father, trying to mediate, suggested we leave the past behind. "The important thing is that we're a family," he said, but those words felt hollow. There were no apologies or genuine acknowledgement of the emotional impact this had caused. I realized then that, for my parents, Reconciliation simply meant moving forward without addressing the underlying issues. Michael, predictably, showed no interest in engaging in the conversation. He seemed perfectly comfortable with the situation and saw no reason to change anything. It was at that moment I made my decision. This wasn't about cutting ties completely, but about establishing healthy distance. I needed to protect my emotional well-being, which meant limiting my interactions with them. Visits became less frequent and conversations grew more formal, focused only on essentials. The pain was still there, but I had learned to manage it without letting it consume me. This decision, though difficult, brought changes to the future of our family dynamic. My parents began to notice my absence more clearly and, over time, made attempts to rebuild our relationship with more genuine gestures. Michael, on the other hand, remained oblivious, continuing to live comfortably in the luxury house. The break wasn't total, but what had existed before never returned to its former state. For me, this was liberating. I learned that reconciliation is only meaningful when there is sincerity and mutual effort. Without that, maintaining a certain distance isn't an act of abandonment but a way of respecting myself and what I need to move forward. Looking back, I realize this story isn't just about a house or poorly thought-out decisions. It's a lesson about what it means to be a family, about the challenges of balancing empathy, respect, and fairness. One of the greatest lessons I've learned is that family favoritism, even when unintentional, has deep and lasting impacts. It's not just about who gets more or less. It's about how each person feels valued within the family dynamic. My parents, in their attempt to protect Michael, didn't realize they were pushing me away, creating a divide that had taken years to form but came to the surface with one simple act. Empathy, both from those making decisions and those affected by them, is essential for maintaining healthy bonds. In my case, I've learned that empathy doesn't mean silently accepting everything. It also means understanding the emotional limitations and motivations of others. My parents aren't perfect, neither am I. Perhaps they acted more out of guilt and compassion than deliberate favoritism. And Michael, for all his complacency in this situation, carries his own battles. That doesn't excuse what happened, but it helps provide context. In the end, this experience taught me something fundamental. Self-worth is non-negotiable. I've learned to set boundaries, to say no when necessary, and to stop seeking validation through others' recognition. This incident revealed that family relationships, while complex, can be fertile ground for personal growth. It wasn't easy, but I've turned that pain into strength and that frustration into clarity about who I am and what I expect from those around me. For anyone reading or hearing this story, the lesson is clear. Don't be afraid to prioritize your peace and value yourself, even if it means questioning dynamics you've always accepted as normal. Welcome to Spooky Stories, the channel where thrilling and mysterious tales come to life. Here you'll hear stories based on real events with names and details changed to protect identities and, of course, to avoid any legal issues. So, get ready to dive into intriguing cases full of twists and turns that will keep you hooked until the very end. If you enjoy chilling and surprising stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. And don't forget to leave a like. It helps us bring even more amazing tales to you. At the end of this video, we've got a suggestion for another thrilling case waiting just for you. Stick around and uncover the secrets behind these dark stories with us.